If I had to sum up the job of an RC controller like this Radiomaster Boxer Crush or this Jumper T15, I would say that its job is to take physical movements of the controls like these sticks, switches, or knobs, and communicate the movements and position of those physical controls to the vehicle so that the vehicle or the flight controller on the vehicle can do whatever it needs to do with that information. And the previous videos in this tutorial series have covered the EdgeTX input, mixer, and output screens. Those are the three screens that are most involved with making that happen. Today, we're going to go in a little bit of a different direction. We're going to cover the EdgeTX model settings screen. And the model setup screen is kind of a catch-all location for a whole bunch of settings that pertain to how EdgeTX handles this model. Some of these settings are little quality of life improvements, and some of them will significantly change how EdgeTX interprets the model. And before we get into that content, you should know that this video is part of a series where I go through a whole bunch of information about EdgeTX, the operating system that runs on our radios, to try and teach people more about it. A lot of people know the basics of using it, just enough to get by on a day-to-day basis, but they don't know, like, when you go through all these menus, like, what do they do? And how do you get the radio to do what you really want it to do? That's what this video series is about. And there's a whole playlist. I want to invite you, after you finish this video, to check out that playlist. It's got a whole bunch of information about EdgeTX and will make you a whole lot smarter about how to use your radio. That's linked in the video description below when you get to the end of this one. We're going to start this video in the color screen radio. If you've got a black and white screen radio like the Boxer Crush, most of the options that we're going to see are going to be here as well. They're just not going to be displayed in quite a colorful way. And we will take a look at the Boxer Crush for comparison, just so you're not lost. But even if you only have a black and white screen radio, you should still watch this section of the video. On the Jumper T15 and all radios with this style of button layout, a tele, a sys, and then 3 buttons down the left side, on those radios, we access the model setup screen by pressing the menu key one time, and that takes us to model setup. If I back out of there, I want to demonstrate to you that if you hold down the menu button one time, it takes you to manage models. So if you're pressing that button and you're getting manage models, you're holding the button down too long. On Radiomaster radios, we've got a sys, a model key, and then 4 buttons down the left side. On this style of radio, we access model setup by pressing the model key one time. That takes us to model select, and it doesn't matter whether you long press or short press, it's always the same thing. We'll then just page one time to get to the setup screen, and that's the model setup screen. At the top of the model setup screen, we've got the model name, labels, and the model image. Labels and the model image, as well as the model name, were all covered in the previous video in this series, Model Management. At least I think it was the previous video. It's earlier in the series anyway. We won't be covering those here. The next option that you see is the ADC filter. Now I'm going to give you a concise recommendation for how to set the ADC filter in just a second, but let me tell you what the ADC filter is. So your controller uses electricity to read the position of the gimbal, and like most electrical devices, that electrical signal is subject to a little bit of noise or interference. And what that means is that even when the gimbal is not moving, the position that the controller senses from the gimbal will have a small amount of jitter in it, and that's where the ADC filter comes in. The ADC filter basically does averaging or low pass filter to filter out that noise, but it also adds a small amount of delay. So the recommendation is that if you have a flight controller like Betaflight that has built-in filtering on the RC signal, that you turn the ADC filter off in your radio, because you don't want the delay of the ADC filter stacked on top of the delay of Betaflight. You just want to give Betaflight the raw RC signal and let it do its superior form of filtering. But you will want to turn the ADC filter on if you have an aircraft with servos or some other vehicle with a physical control that doesn't have any software-based filtering, or if you were using some old flight controller that didn't have any software-based filtering on the RC input. In that case, you want the ADC filter on because bad filtering, suboptimal filtering, is better than none at all. If you've ever gone in Betaflight to the presets tab and you've looked at the RC link presets, that's what these presets are doing, is they're setting Betaflight's filtering specifically for the RC link that you've got. That's the better filtering that I talked about earlier. Now you may notice that the ADC filter had 3 options there: off, on, and global. And here's what that global option means. Right now we're talking about model-specific features. If I turn this off or on, that will be off or on for this specific model. And that makes sense because if I have an airplane with servos, I want the ADC filter on. If I have a multi-rotor with Betaflight, I want the ADC filter off. Those are 2 separate models. And again, we talked about model management in the previous video in this series, so go watch that if you don't know what I'm talking about. There is also a global ADC filter option that changes the ADC filter for the entire radio as a whole. And if you wonder what the heck is the point of that, the answer is that it used to be that the ADC filter was always global and you had no ability to turn it on or off based on loading a model. You would have to manually turn it, which is silly, and EdgeTX fixed that. If I press the Sys key to go to radio setup and then I page to the hardware screen, you can see there is the global ADC filter option, and that is on by default. Any model that has ADC filter set to global will obey that setting, or you can turn ADC filter on or off based on the model. How the right way to do this, I think, depends on whether you fly mostly planes or mostly multi-rotors. If you fly mostly multi-rotors, then probably what you should do is turn the global ADC filter off, and then for any of your airplane models, you turn it on and override that global setting. Or you could set it manually on or off for every single one of your models if you prefer, or if you fly mostly planes, you could set the ADC filter on, and then for all your multi-rotors, manually change it off in the model's settings. Just for perspective, let's take a look at the black and white screen radio, and here we are in the setup screen, and if we scroll down, we should be able to find the same ADC filter option there, and we see we have the same global off and on as we did on the color screen radio. And if I press the Sys key and page to the hardware screen, there it was, and scroll down, I should find the ADC filter option there as well. There it is. There's the global ADC filter. Next up, we have the internal and external RF options, and those are exactly the same. The settings that are going to be there are, I think they're identical between them. These options relate to the communication between the radio and the RF module. So the radio has an internal Express LRS module. It may have an external module that plugs into the module bay in the back. That's going to be the external module. And the radio needs to know how to communicate with that module. The most basic thing we're going to do here is tell the radio what protocol we're going to talk, or what language we're going to talk to that module. And if I look at the internal module, I only have 2 choices here. One is crossfire and one is off. That's because this radio has an internal Express LRS module, and confusingly, crossfire is the protocol that's used to talk to Express LRS modules. That's just something you have to know, and now you do. And the radio knows that there is no other protocol that this could possibly talk, because it's got an internal crossfire module. If we go to the external RF, we can see that by default it's off, but I can set that to many different protocols. And we're not going to go into all these different protocols. Like, for example, XJT is the older FreeSky protocol. If you had a FreeSky XJT module you put in the back to bind to a FreeSky receiver, you would select XJT. Here's Crossfire, which you would use for a TBS Crossfire module or an Express LRS module. Here's FreeSky R9, if you have a FreeSky R9 module. Here's Immersion RC Ghost. All of these are different control protocols, and you would just need to know for any different module that you owned what the correct protocol was to talk to that module. That would be hopefully in the documentation for the module. But the reality is that most people watching this video are going to be using Crossfire. Like, either because you're using Express LRS or because you're using Crossfire. A few people are going to be using Ghost, probably some racers, and a few people are going to be using FreeSky. But if you're using FreeSky, most likely your radio has an internal FreeSky module, not an external one. So there's the options that you have there. There's a special option here in the protocols list, which is multi, and it deserves a little more attention. Multi refers to a multi-protocol or 4-in-1 module. And this is a type of module that supports a whole bunch of different protocols. Like, hold on. Here's the GitHub page for the multi-protocol module firmware. And if we go to the available protocols, here is the complete list of protocols that it supports. Oh my God, look at it all. Most of these are obscure protocols used by Chinese bind and fly drones, and most people aren't going to encounter them. However, they are there. You typically will see a multi-protocol module used with FreeSky, so they support FreeSky receivers all the way up to, but not including FreeSky Access receivers. FreeSky Access broke compatibility with multi-protocol. And FlySky, Futaba, they can bind to. So there are some name Radio Link. There are some more sort of name brand receivers that the multi-protocol module can bind to, and then like 50 different Chinese bind and flies that very few people have. If you have this, then you would select multi. And you should know that radios can be purchased with internal multi-protocol modules as well. And when we select multi, we will have the option to select then this sub-protocol here. And this is the list of, again, very similar to the list that you were seeing on my screen. We would select the correct sub-protocol, and then that would allow our module to bind to our receiver. The exact way to do this is way outside the scope of this video, especially because multi-protocol modules are less and less common today as more and more people switch to, well, let's face it, higher performing, more modern control links. So unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there, but you should know that you have to select the correct protocol, and then the procedure for binding and setup is unique to some of these. And I would recommend, if you've got a multi-protocol module, you go to this page and you use this page to figure out, like, FreeSky, okay? Let's see. FreeSky V25. No, that's not the receiver that I have. You use this page to figure out if there are any sort of caveats or gotchas or what protocol to use. Now, I also want to tell you that if this is set to off, then the module is powered down. And that can be especially confusing if you've got an external module, you put it in the back of the radio and it doesn't turn on. And you're like, what's wrong? Why is it not powering up? Well, if this is set to off, it powers down. And that is true for the internal module as well. If you spend a lot of time using your controller with a simulator as a joystick, you're going to want to turn the internal and external modules off to save battery power. Well, you don't have to, but you could. Next, we've got the status, and you see here it says 50 Hertz. That is showing the packet rate between the module and the radio. And if I set this incorrectly, we're not going to see a status there. We're just going to see 0 Hertz, right? And that tells you that the radio is not talking to the module. For example, if I put an Express LRS module in my radio, and then I set it to Ghost protocol, S-Bus protocol, so the wrong protocol, we would just get a 0 there. In the case of Express LRS, that 50 Hertz is determined if I go into the Express LRS Lua script, which we haven't talked about because that's an Express LRS thing, but here I am in the Express LRS Lua script, and you can see the packet rate is set to 50 Hertz, but if I change that to, let's say, 250 Hertz, then if I back out and go back to the model setup, internal RF, now we can see the status is 250 Hertz. You're going to want to make sure that that is the value you expect. If you've set Express LRS to 250 Hertz, you need to see 250 Hertz there. The other thing is you may see an error counter, ERR, an error counter. And if you see an error counter, it may mean that you've got a problem with the setup of the radio. Now, the way that I showed you baud rate working in the hardware screen is a little bit different if you have an external module. If you have an external module, here, external RF, the baud rate for the external module is specified here in the model setup, not in the hardware screen. Specifically, if I see errors on this status, what that can mean is that the baud rate for the external module is not correct. And although this is not in the model setup screen, I'll show it to you real quick. If I press the sys key and go to hardware, I should see here, internal RF, type crossfire, baud rate 400K. If that baud rate is how fast the communication is between the radio and the module. And the rule of thumb is you want that baud rate as high as it can be. Older radios didn't support higher baud rates, and so it's set to a low value by default, but we should really crank that up. And in fact, let's set that baud rate to a really low value, 115K, the lowest value. And then let's go into our Express LRS Lua script, change our packet rate to the highest value. What should happen, well, what may happen is that the radio will realize I've made a mistake and increase the baud rate automatically. But that low baud rate cannot handle this fast packet rate, and we should get a problem. Ready? Aha, yes, see, it says error, baud rate too low. So the script knows that that's not going to work. What we can do, and what you should do, is go into your hardware screen and raise that baud rate to the maximum value, 5.25 megabaud. And then you want to do that anyway, because that reduces the latency of the control link, and there's literally no downside to doing it as long as you're on a modern radio that can handle that high baud rate. If you've got an old X9D from 2019, maybe you can't do this. And then here in the ExpressLRS Lua script, if I want to, I can go all the way up to 1000 hertz with no problem. I actually don't want to. I like to run at 250 hertz. But like I said, you want the max baud rate to reduce latency. There's one other option you can change here, and it can really screw you up if you don't know what you're doing. Here's that baud rate option. Notice that on the hardware screen, I can also set the type of radio for the internal RF. And the choices are crossfire or multi-protocol. And there are people who think that this changes the radio's internal module from a crossfire or ExpressLRS into a multi-protocol module. It does not. That you have to literally pull a circuit board out of the radio, put a different circuit board in the radio to make that change. If you bought a radio with a multi-protocol module in it, going to this screen and changing the type from multi to crossfire will not turn your radio into an ExpressLRS radio. It just changes, you're just telling the radio what hardware is inside it. You're not actually changing the hardware. And this screws people up because people accidentally buy a 4-in-1 radio when they meant to buy an ExpressLRS radio. Then all their ExpressLRS stuff isn't working. And they go, here's how I fix it. I changed this option. That's not how you fix it. The other problem that I've seen is that if you have a 4-in-1 radio, when you flash EdgeTX with EdgeTX Buddy, it can change it over to crossfire. And then after you flash, your internal 4-in-1 module won't work. And what you need to do is come here to the hardware screen and change this from crossfire to multi because you have a 4-in-1 module and that's the correct setting. But if you have an ExpressLRS radio, you're just going to leave this on crossfire. Now, the next setting here is the channel range, and it controls what channels in the radio are going to be output to this module. You can see here that the radio will always output 16 channels, and we're just choosing which 16 channels we're going to output. And you might think, well, why the heck would you want to do that? Remember that this radio supports up to, I believe it's 32 channels internally in the mixer, but the receiver can only support 16 channels, and some even support less than that. You can have both the internal and the external module active at the same time. So theoretically, you could have two modules and two receivers active at the same time, and you can set the internal module to output channels 1 through 16 and the external module to output channels 17 to 32. And then you have a 32 channel radio. And I don't know why you want that. I don't know what kind of vehicle you're using that needs 32 channels, but that's how you could get it. The last option here is the receiver ID, and that relates to something called model match. And model match is its own boondoggle. And I actually made a video about model match, and I'm going to link it in the video description below. The short version is don't use model match. Just leave all your receivers set to model number 0. And if you don't like that, you can go watch the tutorial about model match. And I'll add it to this playlist too. It deserves to be there. The exact way that model match works varies depending on if you're using FreeSky versus Crossfire versus ExpressLRS, but the concepts are the same, and I'll link to those videos and you can go ahead and watch them. Next, let's talk about these timers, timer 1, 2, and 3. And the first question you might have is, what do I want a timer for? Way back in the day, before we had on-screen displays and telemetry that let us monitor our battery voltage, the way that people knew it was time to land because their battery was going to die was with a timer. And having a timer on the controller was a very convenient thing to do. As soon as you arm, the timer would start counting down, and then when it reached its countdown, an alarm would go off and you would come in and land. This is also something that people running like gas-powered cars do, liquid fuel cars. They may not have a fuel gauge to tell them when their tank is empty, and so they'll use a timer to tell when they need to come in and refuel. There are lots of different things you could use a timer to count, and that's what you would use these for. The reality is I don't use these very much because all of the aircraft that I fly, if I want a timer, the timer is on screen in my goggles, or I'm just monitoring my battery voltage directly. So most of the time these are off for me, but in case you want to use them, let me tell you how they work. And the first thing I'll do is I'll take timer 1 and change it to on, and then some additional options will appear down here. And by default, when I set the timer to on, the timer will just start running all the time. So if I back out here, here's my timer, and my timer is running. It started running the minute I set it to on. Let's just turn this radio off real quick, and we'll turn the radio back on again. You're going to learn something today. And here goes my timer. It's just there on my main screen. Now, realistically, I probably don't want to just have the timer start counting the minute I power up the radio and just keep counting. That isn't that interesting. So what I can do is I can go over here and I can assign the timer to a switch. Let's assign it to my momentary switch, and I'll just do that by pressing the switch while that option is blinking, just like you've seen before. Now, if I back out to the main screen, you'll see that timer is not moving. But if I press the switch, the timer begins moving while that switch is pressed. And if I release the switch, it stops again. That's useful for if you want to start a timer when you arm the quad. You would set your arm switch to start the timer, and as soon as you arm the quad, or arm the plane, then the timer begins counting. You could also tie that timer to a logical switch that is based on your throttle. And we haven't talked about logical switches yet, so I just want you to file this away in your brain. But we could basically say, whenever my throttle is raised above 0, count this timer. And that could be another thing to do if we had maybe an airplane where there wasn't an arm switch necessarily, but I just want to detect when I'm using the battery. The start value controls what time the timer will have at the time that it starts. The default is 0, and it starts at 0 and counts up. But if I change this from 0 to, let's just change it to 1 minute, then an additional option appears, remain elapse. Remain elapse. And that controls whether the timer is counting up or counting down. So I'll just power cycle the radio to reset that timer, and then I'll demonstrate that here the timer is at 100, and if I hold the button down, it begins counting down. And as I release the button, it stops counting down. That's remain. And if I change that to elapse, it'll count up. Notice now it shows 6 seconds because that's how much time had elapsed. If I hold this down, it will begin counting up. And then when it reaches 1 minute, what will happen? That depends on whether we have countdown set to silent, in which case nothing will happen, or beeps, or voice, or haptic. So we can get some kind of an indication that the timer is about to expire. Let's set that to voice and see what happens when we get to the end of the timer. 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49. So you can see 50, 51, it's just warning me that the timer is reaching the end of its value. 54. Okay. The persist option determines whether the timer is persistent across when I change models or when I power cycle the radio. By default, the timer resets when I change models or power cycle the radio, but I can set the persist option to flight or manual reset. And then in order to reset it, I'll press the model key and go to the telemetry screen. And there should be an option here to reset the telemetry. I can't find it. I can't find it in the menu. Okay, well, I'm going to tell you about special functions because we haven't talked about special functions yet, but this is the right time to do it. We will press the model key and we will page to the special functions, and we will create a new special function. It'll be this switch, and 56. It'll be this switch, and the special function will be reset timer 1, and we'll enable that. And then when I press this button, it'll reset the timer. There you go. So that's actually how I would reset a timer. I wouldn't go through the menus. I don't even know where it is in the menus. I'd have a switch to do it. Now, I previously set the timer to on, but there are more options here than just on. Start, throttle, throttle percent, and throttle start. Start means that the timer will start when I hit the switch and then will keep running even after I release the switch. Throttle means that the timer will start when I hit the switch and raise the throttle. So the idea is that as soon as I arm the drone or arm the aircraft, we're not going to start counting the timer until I actually raise the throttle, because that's when we really start running down the battery. This really pertains to tracking your battery usage, which again, we mostly just have telemetry or on-screen displays for that, but not always. The throttle percent means that the timer will count when the throttle is raised, and it will count proportional to the throttle. So when the throttle is fully raised, the timer counts in real time. When the throttle is at 50%, the timer counts half as fast. And the idea is that you're not running your battery down as much, so the timer will count slower and give you more time. Again, not really necessary if you have telemetry or on-screen display that just shows you your battery voltage. And finally, the throttle start option will start the timer when the throttle is raised and the configured switch is activated, but then the timer will ignore the throttle position and just keep counting until the switch is deactivated. And that's different than the throttle option, which counts when the throttle is up and stops counting when the throttle is down. On the color screen radios, the options are exactly the same, but you don't actually have the timers automatically appear on the screen. Instead, you need to manually set up a widget on screen to put that timer on screen. You do that by short pressing the telemetry key and then set up widgets, and then we can put a widget, a timer widget right here, timer 2. So we'll put that timer. The timer source is going to be timer 1, and then now we have that timer on screen. So on the color touchscreen radios, there's some additional steps to set up the screens, but then you have a lot more flexibility in what information you do and don't have on screen. I have a separate video that I've made about widgets, and I will link it in the video description below. This is not officially part of this playlist. It was just a tutorial that I made previously, but it makes sense to show it to you here. And again, it'll be linked in the video description below. Next in the menu, we've got the pre-start checks, and these are checks that the radio does when it first powers up. And like most safety checks, sometimes they can be a little annoying and you want to disable them, and that's what this screen is about. One thing you can do is you can have it display a pre-flight checklist, including an interactive checklist when you power up. Check this out. Oh, control is not in the right position. Okay. There we go. So it's warning us that the switches are not in the right position. This is super useful because, like, if you've got your switch set to arm, or if you've got your landing gear switch set to lift the landing gear, and then you plug in your airplane, and then suddenly the landing gear just go up. This is warning you that the switches need to be in the correct position at power up time. This is a nice safety check, and I leave this on for all my radios. The standard way of approaching switches is to push all the switches away from you before you power up the radio. And on this style of switch, these switches are going to be out, and there you go. Not everybody may do it that way, but that's the sort of de facto standard. I don't think that was the checklist. That was just the switch position warning. Where's my checklist?
Switch warning.
See, that's the same warning. Oh, I don't use this feature. I'm learning things. You have to have a model notes file in the models folder on the SD card, which is a text file and has the exact same name as the model it's for, and then it'll display the text from that file. And you can make it display checkboxes by starting the lines with an equals. That's kind of cool, and the user has to manually check the checkboxes before the model will load. I'm not going to do that, but that's pretty cool, and now you know it exists and you can play with it if you want to. So what we actually saw was the control warning, which is a separate thing. And this is something, as I was saying, that I use all the time. Pre-start checks. So we have the option to warn us when the switches are in the wrong position. And the default is that all the switches are pushed away from us. For example, I like to have my arm switch pulled down and push my arm switch up to arm and down to disarm. So my standard switch position is all the switches pushed away except the arm switch. That's just how my first radio was, and that's how I learned it, and that's how I've always stuck with it. So if you want to change the default switch positions for the radio, or tell the radio that you want it to ignore a certain switch and not warn you about that switch when it powers up, here's how. If I tap on switch SA, I can manually change the position that switch A is supposed to be at. Or if I do this, you can see it's not colored in and switch SA will be ignored. Well, switch SA is my arm switch, so I definitely don't want to ignore it. I can also, I know I can do this, rather than manually setting it, what if I do this? That's it. You long press. So what I can do is I can put the switches in whatever position I want them to be in when I first power up. And then if I scroll down here and long press, it fills in. Long press, I said. There we go. It fills in that switch position. Does it do all the switches or just the one I highlighted? Switch SA is up right now. Watch switch SA. Long press. No, it's not doing it. It's just rolling through. Here on the black and white screen radio, this is my daily driver. I know how this works. If I go to pre-start checks, here's my switch warnings. If I put the switches in an arbitrary position and I long press here, it reads those switch positions. And so that's how I will put the switches however I want them to be when I power up. And then I'll go here and I'll just long press and it'll read those. I can also single click and change them manually, but I don't know why I would ever do that. It seems like that is missing from the color touchscreen radio. What if I tap? What if I long tap? No, it's just not there. As far as I can tell, it's not there. The pot warn will warn you if the potentiometers are not centered. I leave that off because I don't really use the potentiometers for anything mission critical. But if you had like a gimbal or something, you would want it to be centered and you could get a warning for the potentiometer. And the T warning is the throttle warning, which will warn you if the throttle is not all the way down. Or you can put a custom position in. For example, if you have a bird where you need the throttle to be centered when you power up, you can set that throttle position to 50%, and then it'll warn you if the throttle's not in the right position. Is it plus 100 to minus 100? Oh, interesting. So 0 is the center. I see. Minus 100 is all the way down. Okay, good to know. If we look at the pots and sliders warning, we have 3 options, off, on, and auto. On will check the slider positions against the manually configured position. You're going to tell it, I want this slider to be centered, I want the slider to be all the way down, whatever. And then it will always check that position when you power up. Auto means that anytime you turn the radio off, the radio will remember the last position the slider or potentiometer was in, and then when you power up again, it has to be in that position still, or you'll get a warning. The center beep option controls whether the radio will beep when that channel passes through center. So if I set the R for rudder to enable the center beep, watch as I move the stick. Every time I pass through center, it will beep. This can be useful if you have an aircraft where, well, for the spring-loaded channels, it's not that useful. It's just annoying and it beeps all the time and drives people crazy. It could be useful for the throttle if you had an aircraft where you didn't want a spring-loaded throttle, but you still wanted to know when the throttle was centered. For example, you have an acro bird that has altitude hold mode on it, and you need to center the throttle to hold altitude. Next, we come to the trims settings, and this pertains to how the trim switches work. This radio doesn't really have great trim switches. It's got these little hat joysticks. But here on the Boxer, we can see we've got traditional trim switches, and we talked in previous videos about what the trims are. The settings for trims include trim step, which can be either fine, extra fine, medium, or coarse. And basically that is when I hit that trim switch, how much do I trim the channel? Just a little bit, or do I trim it a lot? The right value depends on, well, how precise a change you need to make in your trims. If you've got a vehicle where every time you hit the trim switch, you go, that's not enough, that's not enough, well, then you probably want to use coarse, so you only have to hit the button a couple times. If you've got a vehicle where you need to make very precise changes in the trims, like if you've got a glider, and it's very important that the control surfaces be trimmed exactly right, then you would want to have finer trims. Extended trims. When you have extended trims disabled, you can only trim a small amount around the center of the channel. You can't just trim the channel all the way off to the edge of the channel. When you enable extended trims, you can trim basically all the way to the edge of the channel, and you can throw the channel completely out of whack if you use that power irresponsibly. And finally, display trims changes how the trims are displayed on the main screen. Notice this is set to no. I can't help but notice that here are the trims, right? You see the trim moving right here? And you see it's gone yellow? That's the extended trims. If we had extended trims off, we couldn't go that far. Display trims, no. What if I say yes? What does it do? Nothing. Nothing is different. It displays the numerical trim, but it doesn't. Oh, yeah, I see it. Oh, I see it. Okay. Okay, see, hold on. We're going to zoom in. You can't see that. If you look right down here, do you see that number 60? It's showing the actual trim value.
Trim center.
And which direction it's trimmed. That's cute. What if I set it to change? Oh, it disappears after I move it. Interesting. Most of the time when I'm trimming, I'm not looking down at the screen. I'm looking at the vehicle and I'm bumping the trim and watching how the vehicle responds. So I'm not sure how useful that would be, but now you know it exists. The throttle options. So the first one lets you reverse the throttle. All the way up is 0, all the way down is full. I have no idea why you'd want to do that. Presumably there's a good reason. Tell me in the comments. The throttle source changes which of the physical controls is the throttle. Of course, by default, it's the throttle stick. But theoretically, if you had a vehicle where you wanted a different control to be the throttle, like let's say you had a vehicle where you're just going to turn a motor up to a certain RPM and leave it there, and then you're going to steer the vehicle with a different control. We could set the source to be one of these potentiometers, and then that would be our throttle, and you wouldn't do that most of the time. You're just going to have the throttle be on the stick. Trim idle only. When you trim the throttle, by default, you're trimming the center position of the throttle. You're trimming it up or down, but that's not how the throttle works, especially if you have a liquid fuel engine. What you probably want to do if you're trimming the throttle on a liquid fuel engine is you're trimming the idle value. The engine is kind of lugging and stalling out. You just bump the trim up, and now it's running smoothly. The trim idle only option makes the throttle trim just the bottom of the throttle channel instead of the center point, like trims usually work. And finally, there's the trim switch, which controls which of the trim switches is going to trim the throttle. It's the throttle trim. I don't know why you would change that. Yeah, let me just make the rudder trim the throttle. Okay, thanks for the ability to do that, but don't. In the enabled features, we have the ability to turn on and off certain features of the radio. And notice that this is another case where these features can be changed globally or set on or off in a per model basis. And basically what we're doing is we're turning on and off some of these screens. Like for example, here is the heli setup screen where I set up the collective and the swash plate of my collective pitch helicopter. I don't have any collective pitch helicopters. I don't need to see this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back out and press the Sys key, and I'm going to go to the radio settings where I have the global options. There we go, enabled features, and I'm going to turn off heli setup. And now none of my models will show the helicopter setup screen. Although if I had a helicopter, I could make just that model show it by turning it on in the model settings. Some of this stuff you've seen before, and some of it, and a lot of it you haven't. Like we haven't talked about global variables, curves, logical switches, special functions, and so on. So for the most part, you're not going to know at this point why you would turn some of these on and turn some of them off. But suffice it to say, as we encounter these things, you can turn them on or off if you just want to pretend they don't exist. USB joystick controls the options related to how the radio works when you plug a USB into the top USB port and use it as a joystick to play a simulator. We have the option of classic or advanced. In classic mode, basically you plug it in and all the controls just work. What does advanced mode do? Oh my God. Interface mode, joystick, gamepad, or multi-axis, and I can manually map the channels. Oh, button axis. Wow, there's a lot of options here and I don't know anything about them. I haven't played with this before. This is new. Thank goodness EdgeTX has such great documentation where we can learn about advanced mode. I'm not going to cover this now because I can't cover it because I don't know anything about it. I'm going to tell you it exists. I'm going to point you at the documentation and then maybe I'll come back to it another time. This is really cool. I didn't know this existed. And then we've got two other options, the trainer options and the customizable switches options. For the trainer options, I'm going to refer you again to a previous video that I made showing you how to set up trainer mode or buddy box mode, which can be used to link two radios together where the person doing the training can give and take control of the aircraft from the student. So if the student's about to crash, you just take control and you save the aircraft. A lot of people these days don't use trainer mode. They just train in the simulator and then they fly a real quad. But if you're going to use trainer mode, I've got a tutorial about that. It's a little bit older and the interface is going to look a little different, but it should get you through it. That's linked in the video description below as well. I'll add it to this playlist. And then the customizable switches options is going to get its own video because it's kind of complicated and I think we've gone on long enough. That is it for model setup. You now know all about these model setup options and how to use them. This video is part of a playlist and I'll give you the playlist on a card on screen as well as a link down below if you want to see the other videos in this playlist, and I'll see you there.